The federal courthouse in Manhattan is not a warm building. On a spring morning in 1946, its marble corridors still smell of floor polish and cigarette smoke, and the men filing through its doors are the sort of men who read the financial pages before the sports pages. They have come to watch a criminal trial. The defendants are not gangsters. They're not war profiteers. They're not the corner-cutting industrialists whose names filled the papers during the war years. The defendants are two elderly brothers from New Jersey. One is 81, the other is 74. Between them they have spent at that point 132 combined years working for the same company. They have never worked anywhere else. The younger brother tells a reporter without irony that he began at 15 and never saw a reason to leave. The charge against them is a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The government has argued, and the judge has agreed, that the company these two men run has committed a crime against the American economy. The crime is not price gouging. The crime is not fixing markets. The crime is not adulterating food, or hoarding sugar during rationing, or bribing officials or crushing labor. The crime is that the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company has, for several decades, sold groceries to American families at prices lower than its competitors could match. The victims named in the case are not shoppers. There are no shoppers on the witness list. The victims are the rival grocers, the wholesalers, the middlemen, the small chains and the independent stores who have watched year after year as the brothers' machine passed savings to customers and drew those customers away from every other counter in the country. George Ludlam Hartford, the older of the two, is a small, tidy man who wears the same style of dark suit he wore in 1900. John Augustine Hartford, the younger, is taller, more social, more given to shirt sleeves in the office and to slapping the backs of store managers he visits in cities across the country. Neither of them, according to those who knew them, ever quite grasped why they were being tried. They had built a company that sold food cheaply. That, they thought, was the entire point. That, they thought, was what a grocery company was supposed to do. The judge saw it differently. The judge saw a company so large, so vertically integrated, so relentlessly efficient, that its very existence deformed the market around it. The judge saw a private label empire that made its own bread and roasted its own coffee and shipped it in trucks it owned to warehouses it owned to stores it owned. The judge saw 10 cents of every American food dollar flowing into one company, and the judge saw correctly that the small grocer on the corner could not compete with that. So the judge ruled against the brothers, guilty of a conspiracy in restraint of trade, guilty of monopolizing the food business, guilty, in essence, of feeding Americans too well, too consistently, and for too little. This is the paradox that sits at the center of this story. The largest, most consumer-friendly retail company the United States had ever produced was prosecuted in criminal court by its own government for the offense of being too good at what it did. Two men in their 80s, sons of a Manhattan tea merchant, were held responsible for a machine they had spent their lives perfecting. The machine fed 1 in 10 Americans. It also, according to a federal judge, broke the law. If that sentence sounds impossible, the following hours will make it inevitable. Because the story of how George and John Hartford ended up as convicted antitrust criminals is also the story of how a $3,000 tea business in Lower Manhattan became, for a brief and dazzling stretch of American life, the most influential retail enterprise the country had ever seen. And the story of how that enterprise dissolved, quietly, without ceremony, in a bankruptcy filing in the fall of 2015, is the story of what happens when the two men who built the machine are gone and no one is left who understands the parts. The Wall Street Journal, looking back on it years later, described A&P as the Walmart of its time. The Journal put it more sharply still. A&P, the paper said, was as well known in its heyday as McDonald's or Google is today. That comparison is worth pausing on, because it is easy to hear those words as marketing language, and they are not. They are structural. There was, in the middle decades of the 20th century, no American household untouched by the company. Its red and gold storefront stood on main streets from Bangor to San Diego. Its private label coffee ground in millions of kitchens. Its bread arrived on millions of dinner tables. Its trucks moved between coasts on highways that had not existed a generation earlier. And the two men who owned the machine, who owned nearly all of it between them, lived in the same modest houses they had bought as younger men and drove themselves to work. To understand how the courtroom in 1946 came to happen, the story must be walked back almost 90 years to a narrow storefront at 31 Vesey Street in Lower Manhattan, and to a founder who never lived to see his sons on trial. In 1859, the city of New York smells of coal smoke and horse manure and the salt of the harbour. The clipper ships still come in from Canton and Foochow, their holds packed with tea chests bound in lead foil and stamped with characters no one on the dock can read. Tea in America at that moment is a strange and expensive commodity. It moves through a long chain of hands. The importer sells to the jobber sells to the wholesaler sells to the merchant sells to the shopkeeper sells to the customer. Each hand takes its cut. Each cut is added to the price. A pound of tea that leaves a Chinese warehouse for pennies arrives in a Brooklyn kitchen for $1 or more, and the housewife who pours it does not know, and cannot know, how much of what she paid went to the leaves and how much went to the men in between. Into this system walks a young man named George Huntington Hartford. He is in his late 20s. He has come to New York from Maine by way of a series of small commercial jobs. He is not an inventor. He is not a visionary. He is, by every account, a careful and unromantic man who counts things. He notices what other men do not. He notices in particular the strange geometry of the tea trade, the number of hands, the size of each cut, the distance between what a leaf costs on the dock and what a leaf costs on the shelf. And he notices that the geometry is optional. If a man had the nerve to buy directly from the ship and the storefront to sell directly to the customer, the geometry could be collapsed, the middle could be cut away, and the savings, all of it, could be given back to the person doing the pouring. He does not have this idea alone. His partner is George Francis Gilman, the son of a shipowner who provides the connection to the docks and much of the initial capital. Between them they scrape together $3,000. In 1859 that sum is not trivial. It is roughly the annual salary of a comfortable clerk, or the price of a small brownstone in a lesser neighbourhood, and translated into modern purchasing power, it lands somewhere north of $100,000. It is enough to rent a storefront and warehouse at 31 Vesey Street, in the shadow of what will one day become City Hall, and enough to buy the first shipments direct from the clippers, and enough to print the handbills that begin appearing across the city. The name over the door reads, in gold letters, The Great American Tea Company. The pitch is simple. Tea, from ship to cup, without the men in between. Price is roughly a third of what the older shops charge. Payment in cash, on the spot, no credit, no delivery, no ceremony. The customer walks in, hands over coins, walks out with tea, and the customer, in those first months and years, comes back. Word travels the way word travelled in a 19th century American city. Neighbour to neighbour, kitchen to kitchen. the Great American Tea Company begins printing catalogues and sending them, by mail, to households in towns Hartford has never visited. Orders return in the same mail. Tea goes out in wooden crates on railroad cars. The company is, before it is anything else, a mail-order house. It is, in essence, the direct-to-consumer model, working by post and railway a century and a half before anyone thought to give it a name. The founding logic hardens fast. Every decision the company will make for the next 100 years, every store format and every private label, and every warehouse and every truck route, follows from a single premise laid down at Vesey Street in 1859. The premise is this: between the producer and the consumer stands a series of middlemen, and every one of them takes a share of the price, and every one of them can, in principle, be removed. Remove them, and the consumer pays less. Pay less, and the consumer buys more. Buy more, and the volume drives the cost down further. Drive the cost down, and remove the next middleman. The premise is a wheel. Once it starts turning, it does not want to stop. In 1869, the wheel gets its first great acceleration. That spring, the Golden Spike is driven at Promontory Summit in Utah, and the eastern and western rail lines meet in a single continuous ribbon of iron across the continent. For the first time, a crate of tea landed on a Manhattan dock can move under one company's freight rate to San Francisco. Hartford, watching the ceremony from 3,000 miles away, understands what the ribbon means. It means his market is no longer New York. It is not even the Eastern Seaboard. It is the country. That autumn he renames the business. The Great American Tea Company becomes the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, a name chosen deliberately to advertise in every catalogue and on every wagon that this is a firm which now spans 2 oceans. In the trade the name will be shortened, within a decade, to A and P, 3 letters and an ampersand, and those letters will stay on storefronts for 146 years. Hartford has 2 sons, both of them born in the years after the founding. George Ludlam, quiet and mathematical, joins the business as a boy. John Augustine, 3 years younger, follows him. Neither goes to college, neither wants to. They begin as clerks, at 15, sweeping the warehouse and packing the mail orders, and, in John's case, riding out on the wagons to deliver bulk tea to grocers upstate. Their father, watching them, sees what he wants to see. He sees that the older son has a head for inventory, and the younger a head for people. He sees that between them they contain the entire mind of a merchant. He begins, quietly, to hand them pieces of the machine. By the 1880s, the company has expanded past tea. Coffee, spices, sugar, condensed milk, extracts. And with each new product, the founding premise reasserts itself. Why buy roasted coffee from a middleman when the beans can be bought green off the ship and roasted in the company's own building? Why buy branded goods from a manufacturer when the company can put its own name on the tin? In 1880-something, the storerooms at Vesey Street begin filling with sacks stamped 8 o'clock. It is A&P's private label coffee, roasted in the company's own roasters, sold under the company's own name at a fraction of what the branded coffees cost. The name will outlive the stores. A century later, long after most Americans have forgotten what the letters A and P meant, the red bag of 8 o'clock will still appear on supermarket shelves, a survivor of an empire whose collapse most shoppers never noticed. By the time the founder dies, in the first years of the new century, his 2 sons have already begun to think in a scale their father did not quite reach. George Ludlam, the older, has taken over the finances and the buying. He is the man who counts. John, the younger, has taken over operations and store development. He is the man who moves. Between them they possess what all lasting partnerships possess, and what most family businesses lack, which is a division of the work so complete that neither one intrudes on the other's territory. George does not tell John where to put a store. John does not tell George what to pay for a carload of sugar. And the machine, freed of the sort of family friction that had killed 1,000 other merchant houses, begins to accelerate. The next move is the one that changes American retail permanently. In 1912, John Hartford opens what he calls an economy store. The concept is austere to the point of provocation. A single small storefront on a secondary street where the rent is cheap. No delivery service. No credit accounts. No fancy fixtures. No hand-lettered signs advertising specials. One clerk, sometimes two. Cash on the counter. Groceries in a bag. Out the door. Every cost that could be stripped out has been stripped out, and the savings have been converted with a bookkeeper's precision into lower shelf prices. A customer walking into an economy store in 1912 pays for a pound of coffee or a can of tomatoes or a bag of flour, prices that no independent grocer in the neighborhood can match. Not because the independent grocer is greedy. The independent grocer is not greedy. He is running a store the way stores have always been run, with delivery boys and charge accounts and a clerk who knows every customer's name. He simply cannot carry those costs and hit the Hartford brothers' prices, and so, one customer at a time, he loses her. The economy store is not one store, it is a template. John Hartford, having watched the first one perform, orders another and another and another. The company opens them at a pace that in retrospect seems impossible. 50 stores, 100, 1,000. By 1915 the count is in the low thousands. By 1920 it is approaching 5,000. By 1925 it has crossed 10,000. By 1930, the company operates somewhere between 15,000 and 16,000 stores, a number so large that no other retailer in American history had approached it, and no chain would approach it again for 2 generations. The stores stand in every state, in company towns and mill towns and streetcar suburbs and the small cities of the plains. They stand with the same red and gold signage, the same small floor plan, the same spare interior. A shopper in Cleveland can walk into an A&P and know within a few steps where the coffee is, where the bread is, where the canned goods are. The uniformity is not an accident. The uniformity is the machine. Behind the storefronts, the vertical integration deepens year by year. The company owns bakeries in the cities where its bread is sold, because a loaf that travels only from the company's oven to the company's shelf carries no wholesaler's markup. The company owns coffee roasting plants, 4 of them at the peak, roasting 8 o'clock and Bocar and Red Circle in industrial quantities, and shipping the sealed bags to stores by rail. The company owns dairy plants and creameries. It owns canneries, or it contracts them so tightly that the effect is the same. It owns warehouses, dozens of them, positioned along the rail network so that no store is more than a day or 2 from replenishment. It owns the private brand names that fill its shelves: Ann Page for condiments and prepared foods, Jane Parker for baked goods, Sultana, Iona. Names that mean nothing today but which sat on tens of millions of American shelves in the years before the war. 10 cents of every dollar spent on food in the United States in the years around the Second World War flows through this system and into the ledgers. George Ludlam Hartford is still, in his 70s, reviewing personally 10 cents of every food dollar. The figure is worth holding in the mind. In a country of 130 million people, feeding themselves 3 times a day, 10 cents of every dollar is a river of money whose scale is difficult to summon. It is enough in the currency of the time, to underwrite a small navy. It is enough to make A&P the second largest company in the United States by revenue, behind only General Motors, which built the cars and the trucks and the tanks that defined the era. Two companies stood at the top of the American economy. One made the vehicles, the other fed the people. And of the two, only one was run by two brothers in their 70s who had never worked anywhere else, who had begun as 15-year-old clerks, and who lived in houses their neighbours would have called modest. The comparison the Wall Street Journal would offer decades later is worth returning to now, because it's the only frame that makes the scale legible to a modern ear. A&P at its peak, the Journal wrote, was the Walmart of its time. It was as well known as McDonald's or Google is today. Every household knew the name. Every child recognized the storefront. Every newspaper carried its advertisements. Every politician, at every level, knew the addresses of the local stores because the stores were where his constituents shopped, and knew the company's lobbyists in Washington because the company's decisions bent the price of food from Maine to California. There is, in the American present, no single retailer that occupies quite the position A&P occupied in the American past. Walmart is larger in absolute dollars, but faces a fragmented grocery landscape. Amazon is larger still, but sells across categories. The particular concentration A&P achieved, a single chain feeding 1 in 10 Americans at every meal, has no living analogue. It existed once, for a stretch of decades, and it is largely forgotten now. The forgetting is part of the story. But before the forgetting there is the reckoning, and the reckoning begins in Washington in the mid-1930s, when a group of small grocers and their trade associations arrive on Capitol Hill with a case to make. They tell the congressmen who represent them that the Hartford brothers are killing them. They tell them that no honest local grocer, no matter how careful, can price against a company that owns its own bakery and its own coffee roaster and its own warehouses and its own trucks, and negotiates volume discounts from every supplier that will still return its calls. They tell them that the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, whatever its founder had intended in 1859, has become in 1935 a threat to a way of American life. The congressmen listen, and the congressmen begin to draft a bill. The bill will be introduced in 1936. It will carry the names of two lawmakers, a senator from Arkansas and a representative from Alabama, and it will be signed into law by a president who has already begun to take an interest in the two elderly brothers in New Jersey and their strange and enormous company. In the corridors of the Capitol and in the columns of the trade press, the bill will acquire a nickname that will follow it into the history books. The lawmakers will call it, without embarrassment and often with pride, the Anti-A&P Act. And in a locked drawer some years later, there will be a promissory note for $200,000, signed by the son of a sitting president, made out to John Augustine Hartford, and dated in the middle of the years when the government was preparing its case. The Robinson-Patman Act, in its plain language, does something modest. It says that a supplier cannot sell the same goods to two different buyers at two different prices unless the difference in price can be justified by a difference in the cost of serving those buyers. Read aloud, it sounds like a fairness measure, the kind of provision that any decent legislature might pass on any decent afternoon. Read against the American grocery business of 1936. It is something else entirely. It is a scalpel, and the tumour it has been designed to cut out has a name, and the name is on every street corner in the country. Consider what the law actually forbids. A canner in New Jersey, packing tomatoes by the truckload, is no longer permitted to offer a lower per-case price to the buyer who takes 10,000 cases than to the buyer who takes 50. A coffee importer at the docks in New York, unloading beans from Brazil, is no longer permitted to reward the customer who buys a shipload with a discount unavailable to the customer who buys a sack. The volume discount, the oldest and most intuitive mechanism in commerce, the reason wholesale has always cost less than retail and always will, is now legally suspect. Not banned outright, made dangerous, made prosecutable. Made a thing a supplier must think twice about before offering, because to offer it is to invite a federal complaint from every smaller buyer who did not receive the same price. The effect on A&P is immediate and structural. The company has spent 77 years learning how to buy in quantities no competitor can match. It has built warehouses and rail sidings and a fleet of trucks precisely because scale, in the grocery business, is the only durable advantage. Its private labels exist because its purchasing power exists. Its low shelf prices exist because its purchasing power exists. Take away the purchasing discount, and the mechanism unwinds. The Hartford brothers do not need a lawyer to explain this to them. They have been in the business since they were 15. They know what the law means the day it is signed. The nickname the Anti-A&P Act appears in the trade press within weeks. It appears in the speeches of the small grocer associations who lobbied for the bill, and it appears without shame, because the shame that ought to attach to such a designation has been overwhelmed by the political victory of having passed the thing. The New England Historical Society, cataloguing the episode decades later, will note the nickname without any suggestion that it was a slur or a misinterpretation. It was a plain-spoken description of what the law was for. Congress had passed a statute against a particular company. The statute did not name the company, because statutes rarely do. But everyone in the chamber knew the target. Everyone in the industry knew the target, and the target knew. The question the audience is being invited to sit with is uncomfortable, and it should remain uncomfortable. Who did the United States government protect in 1936? It did not protect consumers. Consumers were, at that moment in the depths of the Depression, paying less for food at A&P than they had paid at any point in the previous generation. Every dollar a family spent at an A&P store went further than the same dollar spent at the independent grocer down the street, and every family that shopped there knew it. The government did not protect workers. A&P employed roughly 100,000 people at the time of the act, and paid them, by the standards of the industry, competitively. The government did not protect suppliers. Suppliers in the aggregate sold more product because A&P moved more product. The farmers who filled A&P's warehouses moved crops that would otherwise have rotted. The canners who packed A&P's private labels ran their lines closer to capacity. What the government protected was the middle. It protected the wholesaler A&P had cut out. It protected the small grocer who could not compete on price. It protected a way of doing business that had existed for a long time, and that a more efficient way of doing business was in the process of replacing. It is possible to argue that this protection was worthwhile, that a nation of small grocers was a better nation than a nation of chain stores, that community mattered more than efficiency. Reasonable people made that argument at the time, and reasonable people still make it. But the argument has to be made honestly. The Robinson-Patman Act did not lower the price of food, it raised it. And it raised it deliberately by making it illegal for the most efficient company in the industry to pass its efficiencies on to the customer. That is the turning point. For 77 years, A&P had grown by being better at its trade than the men who competed with it. Its enemies had been other grocers, other wholesalers, other chains, and it had beaten them all in the market where such battles are supposed to be settled. Now, for the first time, its enemy was the state. Not a state that had discovered fraud, or price-fixing, or monopolistic collusion of the kind the Sherman Act was originally drafted to prevent. A state that had been persuaded by the losers in a fair fight to change the rules of the fight itself. The Hartford brothers understand this. They also understand that the act by itself is not the end of the matter. A law that everyone agrees was written against a single company is a law that invites the executive branch to enforce it against that company. And the executive branch by 1936 has a president who has taken an interest. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is not, by inclination, a friend of chain stores. His political base includes a great many small merchants and their trade associations, and his rhetorical style, honed through the fireside chats, favours the small and the local and the human against the abstract and the corporate and the large. He has said, in speeches and in private, that concentrations of economic power make him uneasy. Whether that unease is philosophical or pragmatic is a matter historians still argue about. What is not in dispute is that his Department of Justice, under Attorney General Frank Murphy, and later under Thurman Arnold, spends the late 1930s building antitrust cases against a series of large American companies, and that A&P is prominent on the list. The case against A&P is being assembled through the years 1937, 1938 and 1939. Investigators fan out across the country, subpoenaing purchasing records, interviewing suppliers, cataloguing the internal documents in which A&P's buyers had, for decades, spoken candidly about volume discounts and preferred terms. The company cooperates because it has to. Its lawyers advise a defensive posture. Its executives, including John Hartford, are called to Washington. They testify. They answer questions. They watch the outlines of a federal indictment take shape. And in the middle of these years, in the summer of 1939, John Hartford receives a telephone call. The details of the transaction have survived because they were later entered into the record of a separate proceeding, and because Hartford himself, an old man by then and a man not given to lying, testified to them under oath. Elliott Roosevelt, the president's second son, is starting a radio venture. He needs $200,000. He has been unable to secure it through the ordinary channels of commercial lending, which by 1939 have grown wary of the president's family and the reputational hazard of underwriting its ambitions. He calls John Hartford. Hartford hesitates. He is not in the radio business. He has no interest in the radio business. He does not know Elliott Roosevelt and has no reason to lend him money. He says something to this effect, and then, according to his own testimony, the telephone is passed, and Franklin Roosevelt himself comes on the line, and the President of the United States tells the chairman of A&P that his son's radio venture is a sound business proposition. Hartford lends the money. $200,000 in 1939 translated to the currency of the present is roughly $4.5 million, give or take the index used. It is not a life-changing sum for a man of Hartford's wealth. It is a life-changing sum for almost anyone else. It is not the size of the loan that matters, though. It is the timing. The Department of Justice, at the moment the check is written, is actively assembling a criminal antitrust case against the company Hartford chairs. The plaintiff, in effect, is the executive branch. The executive branch, in the person of its head, has just personally recommended a loan to the defendant's chairman on behalf of his own son. Hartford will say, later, that he felt on the spot. He will say that he believed the loan was a way of being taken off the hook regarding the anti-chain store legislation, then percolating through Congress. He will say, in a phrase that has the ring of a man who has thought about it many times, that he was not interested in radio, and he was not asking any favours. What he does not say, because he does not need to, is that the President of the United States had asked him for a favour at a moment when the President's Department of Justice was preparing to indict him. The favour is granted. The prosecution proceeds. That is the part that matters. Whatever calculation was being made in the White House, whatever expectation had been communicated or implied, the antitrust case against A&P is not called off. It is not slowed down. It is not softened. It moves forward through 1940, through 1941, into the war years, gathering evidence and refining its theory, and when it is finally filed, it will be filed in the ordinary way, by the ordinary lawyers, in a federal courtroom in Danville, Illinois, chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with any promissory note in a locked drawer in New Jersey. The radio venture fails. Elliott Roosevelt's business plan, which the president had personally described as sound, collapses within 3 years. By 1942, the enterprise is in receivership and the loan is unpaid. It is at this point that Jesse Jones, the Secretary of Commerce and one of Franklin Roosevelt's closest political allies, intervenes. Jones offers Hartford $4,000 to close the account. Hartford accepts. He writes off the remaining $196,000 as a bad debt on his tax return, which is his legal right and which is, in the end, the only recovery he will ever see. The transaction is not disclosed publicly at the time. It surfaces only later, in testimony given for other purposes, and even then it does not become a scandal. Franklin Roosevelt is dead by then. The war is over. The country has other concerns. The story is filed in the archives of what did not quite happen, or happened without consequence, or happened and was forgiven because the man at the centre of it had won the war. But the record is clear enough. In 1939, while the government was building a criminal case against the largest grocer in the United States, the President of the United States personally solicited a substantial loan from that grocer's chairman on behalf of his own son. The loan was made. The case continued. The loan was never repaid in full, and no one in the executive branch at any point disclosed the entanglement to the court, to the Congress, or to the public. What one makes of this depends on temperament. A cynical reading holds that Roosevelt tried to buy off Hartford and failed, that the antitrust machine had acquired enough of its own momentum by 1939 that even the president could not have stopped it if he had wanted to, and that Hartford's money was extracted precisely because the president knew he could not stop it, and wished to extract something from the man anyway. A more charitable reading holds that the two matters were entirely unrelated, that Roosevelt saw no connection between his son's radio finances and the pending grocery litigation, that great men are often careless with the appearances of impropriety, and that nothing corrupt occurred because nothing corrupt was intended. Both readings are available. What is not available is the reading in which the loan did not happen. It did happen. The record is on the record. The prosecution reaches trial in 1946. By then the war is over. The Hartford brothers have aged another 7 years, and the world in which A&P had risen has been replaced by a world in which the American consumer economy is about to be reinvented on lines A&P itself had pioneered. The federal judge in Danville is named Walter Lindley. He hears months of testimony. He reads warehouses of documents. He listens to the government explain, at length what the crime is. The crime, when the judge finally articulates it in his ruling, is this. A&P has integrated its operations. It buys from its own suppliers. It manufactures its own brands. It moves goods through its own warehouses and its own trucks. In some departments, in some periods, it prices below cost in order to drive volume through the stores as a whole. It uses its scale to negotiate prices from outside suppliers that smaller buyers cannot match. It does all of this, the judge finds, in a coordinated and deliberate way, and it does so with the effect of restraining trade. Because the trade that is restrained is the trade of the smaller competitors, who cannot match A and P's prices and are driven out of business as a result. Restraint of trade under the Sherman Act is illegal. The judge finds it. The Hartford brothers are guilty. Read the ruling carefully, and the paradox is not hidden. It is written into the text. The judge does not find that consumers were harmed. The judge does not find that prices were too high, or that quality was too low, or that any customer of any A&P store received anything other than a good product at a fair price. What the judge finds is that A&P was too efficient. Its efficiency, by lowering its prices, made it impossible for less efficient competitors to survive. That is the crime. The crime is not against the consumer. The crime is against the competitor. And the statute the crime is prosecuted under is a statute that had been written half a century earlier to protect consumers from monopolies that raised prices, not from chains that lowered them. There is a body of scholarship that has argued in the decades since that the A&P prosecution represents one of the strangest inversions in the history of American antitrust. The doctrine the Sherman Act embodied at its birth was consumer welfare doctrine. The evil the Act was designed to combat was the trust that used monopoly power to overcharge. By 1946, that doctrine had been quietly abandoned in favor of a competitor welfare doctrine, in which the health of the market was measured by the number of surviving firms rather than by the prices those firms charged their customers. Under the older doctrine, A&P was innocent. Under the newer doctrine, A&P was guilty. The change had not been made by any statute. It had been made by the accretion of cases, by the choices of prosecutors, by the shifting mood of the political branches, and by the sustained lobbying of the small merchants whose survival depended on the change being made. The mechanism the Hartford brothers were convicted for is, in every essential respect, the mechanism that Sam Walton would build his company on 20 years later. Walmart's private labels, Walmart's owned distribution centers, Walmart's fleet, Walmart's ability to walk into a supplier's office and dictate terms because it accounts for a majority of that supplier's revenue. Walmart's willingness to price certain departments below cost in order to drive traffic through the whole store. Every element of the Walmart model was present in the A&P model by 1930, and every element of the A&P model was declared, in a federal courtroom in Illinois, to be a criminal conspiracy and restraint of trade. Amazon's model rests on the same foundations: its private labels, its logistics network, its willingness to run entire categories at a loss in order to acquire the customer for other categories. Costco, Kroger's owned brands, Aldi's cost structure, every low-price empire that has been built in the United States since 1946 has been built on the blueprint the Hartford brothers drew and were convicted for drawing. None of the men who built those later empires went to trial for it. None of them stood in a federal courtroom at the age of 80 and heard a judge announce that the work of their lives had been a crime. The Hartford brothers did. George is 81 years old on the day the ruling is handed down, John is 74. They have spent between them more than a century in the grocery business. They started as boys under their father. They have never, either of them, worked anywhere else. They have fed the country through 2 world wars and the Great Depression. They have paid their workers, filed their taxes, kept their books, and appeared when summoned. On the day the ruling arrives, they are informed by their lawyers that they have been found guilty of a federal antitrust crime, and that the company they built is required, under the terms of the decision, to modify its operations in ways that will make it structurally impossible to compete on the terms it has always competed on. They do not, by any account that survives, protest publicly. They do not appear on the radio. They do not write open letters. They are private men in the manner of their generation, and they absorb the verdict as their generation was taught to absorb bad news. They go back to their offices. They speak with their managers. They begin the slow work of complying with the decree that requires them to unbuild, piece by piece, the machine they have spent their lives building. The company will survive them for a while. The machine will keep turning for a while, because a machine built as carefully as this one does not stop the moment its designers are told to step away from it. It will keep turning through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, feeding the country, filling its shelves, opening its stores in the morning and closing them at night. But something has ended, and everyone inside the company knows it has ended, even if no one outside the company has yet noticed. The 2 men who understood the machine are old, and the country they built the machine to serve is about to begin forgetting, slowly at first and then all at once, that the machine was ever theirs. John Hartford dies first. It is September of 1951, and he is 79 years old. He has outlived the trial by 5 years and the empire's peak by 21. He collapses in a business meeting in New York, which is the way a man of his generation and his temperament would have chosen to go if he had been asked, though there is no evidence anyone asked him. He had come to work that morning as he had come to work almost every morning since he was 15 years old. The obituaries are respectful and short. They describe a private man who ran the second largest company in the United States and preferred to eat lunch at his desk. They do not linger on the antitrust case. The case is 5 years old by then, and the country has moved on to other worries. George follows in September of 1957. He is 92. He has been the older brother his entire life, and he is the older brother at the end of it, outlasting John by 6 years almost to the day. He dies at home, in the quiet manner of a man who has arranged everything in advance. The company he leaves behind is still, on paper, one of the largest retailers in the world. It still operates thousands of stores. It still carries the private label brands the brothers built. It still owns the bakeries and the coffee roasters and the canneries and the warehouses and the trucks. The machine, on the day George Hartford is buried, is still turning. But the men who understood the machine are gone, and the men who inherit it do not understand it the way the brothers did, because the men who inherit it did not build it, and no one who did not build a machine like this one can be expected to understand what it is actually for. What the machine was for, in the hands of the brothers, was the extraction of every possible efficiency and the transmission of that efficiency in the form of low prices to the customer at the checkout counter. That was the entire theory of the business. The brothers were not indifferent to profit, but they treated profit as the residue of a well-run operation rather than as the operation's purpose. They kept margins thin on principle. They reinvested aggressively. They fought each price war as if the company's survival depended on winning it. Because in the brothers' understanding of the grocery trade, the company's survival did depend on winning it. A grocery chain that stopped fighting on price stopped being a grocery chain. It became something else. It became a business that happened to sell groceries, which is a different kind of business entirely, and a more fragile one. The men who inherit A&P in 1957 do not see it this way. They see a mature company with a dominant market position and a long history of returning cash to shareholders. They see, in the language of the era's business schools, an asset to be managed. Their instincts are custodial rather than aggressive. They are not builders, they are stewards. And what they are stewarding, without quite realizing it, is the accumulated momentum of a machine that has already begun, in ways not yet visible on the balance sheet, to slow. The America of 1957 is not the America the brothers built their company in. The country is moving. It is moving out of the cities and into the suburbs, into subdivisions with wide streets and driveways and two-car garages, into a new geography of daily life in which the small urban grocery store on the corner is no longer where the family shops. The family shops on Saturday, in the car, at a store with a parking lot. The store has aisles wide enough for 2 carts to pass. It carries not only groceries but housewares and clothing and gardening supplies and small appliances. It is not a grocery store in the old sense. It is a supermarket, and beyond the supermarket, forming on the horizon, is something larger still. A store the size of a warehouse, in which every category of household purchase is consolidated under a single roof. Kroger sees this. Safeway sees this. The regional chains that had spent the 1930s and 1940s watching A&P eat their lunch see it, and they begin, through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, to build for it. They close their small urban stores. They buy tracts of land at the edges of the new suburbs. They put up buildings 4 and 5 times the size of the old A&P economy stores. They widen the aisles. They add the parking lots. They invest in refrigeration, in produce departments, in in-store bakeries and delicatessens designed to give the suburban shopper a reason to consolidate a week's purchases in a single trip. They adopt, in short, the tools of scale that A&P had pioneered, and they apply those tools to the format the country is moving toward. A&P does not. A&P's leadership, in the years after George Hartford's death, looks at the thousands of small urban stores the brothers had opened and sees an asset base too valuable to abandon. The stores are paid for. The leases are old and cheap. The neighborhoods around them, though thinning, are not yet empty. Closing them means writing down the value of the real estate and admitting that the company's physical footprint, the great achievement of the brothers' expansion, is now a liability rather than an asset. Nobody wants to be the manager who signs the paperwork on that admission, so the paperwork does not get signed. The small stores stay open, one after another, in neighborhoods that empty out around them, until the sales per square foot decline to a point where no amount of central office cost-cutting can rescue them, and then they close in ones and twos, quietly, without announcements, the way an old man's teeth fall out. Meanwhile, the private labels, which have been the brothers' most powerful weapon, begin to fade. 8 o'clock coffee, Ann Page, the Jane Parker Bakery brand, the entire architecture of house brands that had allowed A&P to underprice the national manufacturers and keep the difference in the customer's pocket, is still on the shelves, but the shelves themselves are shrinking, and the investment in the roasters and the bakeries and the canneries that made those brands possible is not being renewed. Vertical integration, the machine's central innovation, requires constant capital expenditure. The plants must be modernized, the trucks must be replaced, the warehouses must be expanded. None of this is glamorous work, and none of it produces the kind of quarterly earnings numbers that keep a dividend intact. Under the brothers, it had been done because the brothers understood that if it were not done, the machine would eventually stop. Under their successors, it is done less and less, and then hardly at all, because the successors understand something different, which is that the dividend must be maintained. The dividend is maintained. Year after year through the 1960s, A&P returns cash to its shareholders at rates that would have appalled the brothers, because the cash being returned is not the residue of a well-run operation, it is the seed corn of the operation itself. The plants that are not being modernized are still being depreciated on the books. The stores that are not being replaced are still being valued at cost. The company, viewed from the outside, still looks like the company the brothers built. Viewed from the inside, it is being consumed. There is a moment in the middle 1970s when the company almost saves itself. It develops a new store concept, larger than the old economy stores, priced aggressively, stripped down in the manner that would later be called warehouse retailing. It is called the Golden Key, and it works. Customers respond. The stores that carry the new format perform in their early results in a way that recalls the early economy store expansion of 1912. It is briefly the old A&P again in a new skin, doing what the brothers had done, cutting cost, cutting price, growing volume, taking share, and the company shuts it down. The executives who look at the Golden Key results do not see a path forward. They see a threat. The Golden Key stores are cannibalizing the traditional A&P stores in the same markets. They are producing higher volumes at lower margins, which is precisely what the brothers would have wanted, and which the current leadership cannot tolerate, because the traditional stores are what the dividend is calculated against, and the transition would require years of depressed earnings while the new format scaled. The men in charge cannot bring themselves to accept those years. They kill the Golden Key. They return their attention to the traditional stores which continue to decline. It is the single clearest illustration in the company's post-war history of what the brothers meant when they said that a grocery chain that stopped fighting on price stopped being a grocery chain. A&P, in the moment of the Golden Key decision, stops being a grocery chain in the sense the brothers had built it to be one. It becomes, formally and finally, a business that happens to sell groceries. The phrase that circulates inside the company through these years, repeated in meetings and printed in internal memoranda, is that you cannot argue with 100 years of success. It is offered as wisdom. It functions as an epitaph. The men who repeat it do not seem to understand that the 100 years of success they are invoking was produced by a specific set of practices, none of which they are still following, and that success purchased under one set of conditions does not carry forward automatically when the conditions change. The brothers had never argued with 100 years of success. They had argued with the previous week's sales figures every week for their entire working lives. That was the argument that produced the success. Their successors, mistaking the outcome for the cause, preserve the outcome and abandon the cause, and the outcome, cut off from the cause, begins to wither. By 1979, A&P has been sold. A German retailer, the Tengelmann Group, acquires a controlling stake, and the company enters a long twilight of foreign ownership, restructurings, brand relaunches, and store closures. There will be moments of apparent revival. There will be new logos and new formats and new executive teams brought in with mandates to turn the company around. None of it will work, because none of it can address the underlying condition, which is that the machine has been running for decades on the fumes of the brothers' original investment, and the fumes are, by the end of the 1970s, nearly exhausted. Walmart in 1979 has just crossed 1,000 stores. Sam Walton is running it out of Bentonville with a private label strategy, a distribution network, and a pricing philosophy that would be, to any A&P manager who had worked under the brothers, immediately and completely recognizable. Walmart is building, in the American South and the American Midwest, the store the Hartford brothers would have built if they had been born 50 years later and if the federal government had not intervened. There is no antitrust case against Walmart in 1979. There will not be one. Walmart will grow through the 1980s and the 1990s at rates that make A&P's growth in the 1920s look modest, and it will grow using tools that A&P was convicted for using, in an antitrust environment that has quietly abandoned the competitor welfare doctrine and returned, without formally saying so, to the consumer welfare doctrine that would have exonerated the brothers in 1946 if it had been in force then. The Robinson-Patman Act remains on the books. It is simply, by the 1980s, no longer enforced. The prosecutors have moved on. The small grocers whose lobbying produced the act have mostly gone out of business anyway, killed by the very format A&P failed to build and Walmart did. The stores continue to close through the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, one by one, in ones and twos, the way an old man's teeth fall out. A first bankruptcy comes in 2010. A restructuring follows. New capital is brought in. Promises are made. The stores continue to close. A second bankruptcy comes in the summer of 2015, and this one is terminal. The company files for Chapter 11 protection, and it becomes clear within weeks that the filing is not a restructuring but a wind-down. The remaining stores are put up for sale. Some are bought by competitors. Some are bought by regional chains. Some are simply closed and their leases returned to the landlords. In November of 2015, the last of the corporate operations are dissolved. 296 stores remain at the moment of the final filing, out of the 16,000 that had operated at the peak. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, founded in 1859 at 31 Vesey Street in Manhattan on $3,000 of borrowed capital, ceases, after 156 years, to exist. The news is carried briefly in the business sections. The Wall Street Journal writes an obituary that describes A&P as the Walmart of its time, a company that had once been as familiar in American life as McDonald's or Google is today. It is a striking phrase, and it is exactly correct, and it is read by very few people, because by November of 2015, almost no one under the age of 50 recognizes the name A&P at all. The company that had once fed 1 in 10 Americans dissolves into the archives without a ceremony. The stores are converted or demolished. The private labels are sold off to whoever will buy them. 8 o'clock coffee survives, in the hands of a different owner, on shelves in other companies' stores. The bakeries and the canneries and the warehouses had been shut down decades earlier. The trucks had been sold off. The trademarks pass through a series of holding companies and eventually settle somewhere quiet. There is no monument. There is no museum. There is no plaque on the building at 31 Vesey Street, which was demolished long ago, indicating that the largest retail company in the history of the United States was founded there. What remains is the pattern. The pattern is visible if you know where to look, in the aisles of every Walmart, in the fulfillment centers of every Amazon, in the private label lines at every Costco and every Kroger and every Aldi, in the routing algorithms of every grocery delivery service, in the vertical integration of every major American retailer. The tools the brothers invented are, in 2015 and after, simply the way American retail works. Nobody thinks of them as innovations anymore, because they have been the water the industry swims in for so long that the water has become invisible. The brothers, who spent their lives in that water, and who were convicted for the way they moved through it, are not remembered as innovators. They are not remembered at all outside the specialist histories. and the question the trial raised in 1946, the question the government asked and answered, and then, over the following decades, quietly stopped asking, is still there. It is being asked again in a different vocabulary in the antitrust actions now pending against Amazon and Google and the largest of the technology platforms. The lawyers argue in briefs and in congressional hearings about whether a company that has grown to dominance by giving consumers what they want at prices competitors cannot match should be broken up, restrained, forced to divest, or left alone. The arguments are almost word for word the arguments made about A&P in the 1930s and 1940s. The prosecutors invoke the harms to competitors. The defenders invoke the benefits to consumers. The judges will decide one case at a time on the record before them, and the country will absorb the decisions without ever, quite, resolving the underlying question. The underlying question is the one the Hartford brothers were the first to answer in practice and the first to be punished for answering. Whether a company that becomes very good at giving Americans what they need, at prices that undercut everyone who tried before, has performed a public service or committed a public offence. Whether efficiency at that scale is a gift or a threat. Whether the machine that feeds the country cheaply is, by virtue of feeding the country cheaply, too powerful to be permitted to exist. The country has never answered this question, though it has litigated it repeatedly, and the pattern of the litigation suggests that the country does not want to answer it, because to answer it would require choosing, once and clearly, between the small merchant and the low price, between the local business and the national efficiency, between the world the brothers found in 1859 and the world they left in 1957. George and John Hartford chose. They chose the low price. They chose the national efficiency. They chose, in every decision they made across the 7 decades of their working lives, the customer at the checkout counter over the competitor down the street. They were convicted for the choice, and their company was dismantled, first by decree and then by decades of drift. And the choice they made was made anyway, by others, without them, on the foundations they had laid. The America the brothers built for is the America the country now lives in. It shops in the stores they would have recognized instantly. It orders from the warehouses they would have understood before the door closed behind them. It pays prices, adjusted for inflation, and for the enormous productivity gains of the century since 1912, that would have satisfied even their exacting standards. It does not know their names. It has forgotten the company. It has forgotten the trial. It has forgotten, most completely, that there was ever a moment when the government of the United States stood in a federal courtroom and argued, before a judge, that feeding Americans cheaply was a crime, and won. The verdict remains on the books. The country lives, every day, inside the world that verdict tried to prevent, and does not know that it does. Somewhere in the archives, the transcripts wait, in boxes that are rarely opened, in a language no one is any longer trained to read. 2 old men, in the spring of 1946, walked out of a courtroom in Manhattan and went back to their offices to begin the slow work of unbuilding what they had built. They finished the work. It took them the rest of their lives, and then it took the rest of the century, and by the time it was done, no one was watching. The lights in the last stores went out one at a time. Nobody noticed when the last one closed.